Okay, I am happy to introduce to you Dr. Mark Kovacs of Kovacs Institute. He's a world-renowned author and performance physiologist with an extensive background training elite athletes. So Mark, go ahead and take it away.
Wonderful. First off, thank you so much for hosting this educational event. My background, I'm a tennis player. I won an NCAA title in tennis at Auburn University, played professionally. I headed up sports science, strength and conditioning at the USTA for a number of years. Then went on and worked with Gatorade, heading up the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. And then with a few different folks, we set up the International Tennis Performance Association, which is the leading sports science and tennis fitness organization in the world. We have members in nearly 50 countries, and the focus really is on helping coaches, trainers, therapists better develop tennis players. And then over the last 5 or 6 years, we've had the Kovacs Institute here based out of Atlanta, where we apply sports science principles to improving athletic performance with a specific emphasis in tennis. So very excited today to talk on the topic of dynamic warm-ups and dynamic stretching. From my perspective, I got into dynamic warm-ups and dynamic stretching really early on in my research career. I have a PhD from the University of Alabama, and one of my first ever published papers was on this topic. So this topic's near and dear to my heart, and it's one of the most misunderstood areas of tennis training. Unfortunately, a lot of people see the warm-up period as just a time to get the body warm, really just to sweat a little bit, get the heart rate up, and get going. If that's the only reason you do a warm-up, then there's a lot of ways you can do it. You can run 4 laps around the courts, and that will cover that. The reason we want to optimize that time period is it's that one time every training session where you can actually implement a structured training program for your athletes on a daily basis. So we don't just want the warm-up period to be seen as a warm-up for tennis. We actually want it to be seen as a full training session. It may only be 5 minutes. It may be 10 minutes. Depending on who you work with, it could be a lot longer than that. Some of the pros I work with will warm up for over an hour because we're working on things at the same time. And as we go through the presentation, the goal isn't for you to walk away with just a bunch of exercises to do. I'll give you some great resources where you can find exercises. It's more about how do you structure it? How do you apply it for your environment? And are you optimizing your time? So that's going to be what we discussed today. So if you have a look here, what we're looking at is an exercise that people do. And the reason I'm showing this slide is I want you to look at and ask yourself, what is the purpose behind this? You can do a lot of different exercises, but you've got to ask yourself, what's the benefit? What's the value? What are you trying to improve? And also, what is the risk-reward ratio? As we can see here, the risk-reward ratio wasn't very good. The risk was much higher than the reward. So as we go through today, keep that in mind as we discuss exercises, what you should and shouldn't do, how do you structure it, and things like that. So there's really 4 goals of a structured warm-up. You have the physiological, get the heart rate up, get the blood flow going, get your inner workings of the body primed so that you can play tennis at a good level. Psychological, this is many times not a focus of this time period, and it should be. Many times your players are coming from class, they're coming from somewhere else, they're coming from a different environment, and there's always this transition period. And many times we allow a few minutes of chit chat, of socialization, letting players decompress a little bit from wherever they were. And that psychological piece is really important. And then once you have a signal or a cue or a trigger, depending on what you want to call it, that's the point where the athlete goes from whatever they were doing to getting the mind right and getting them focused for the upcoming tennis practice or match. And then you've got those 2 at the bottom. You've got the performance aspect of the warm-up. What are you trying to work on to make your athlete, your tennis athlete, better? Meaning, are you working on speed, strength, stability, range of motion? What are the components that you're working on in your workout? And the 4th piece is injury prevention. Do you have enough of the right exercises in your warm-up to make sure that your athlete is doing the needed movements to help reduce the likelihood of injury. So we know in tennis, for example, that their shoulder range of motion, internal shoulder range of motion, is somewhat limited. So we have to make sure that we do some things to work on that, knowing that that's the limitation. We also know that hip flexors get really tight because we ask our athletes to be in an athletic stance, split step, ready position all the time. So you have to have a hip flexor kind of exercise or two in your warm-up routine. So those are just some basic, simple examples of how to apply these 4 basic goals. So next time you go out with your players and you're working on your warm-up, ask yourself, am I physiologically getting them prepared the way I need to? Am I psychologically preparing my athlete? And then am I improving their performance? And am I reducing the likelihood of injury? If you can check off those 4 boxes as part of your warm-up, that means that you've got a well put together dynamic warm-up routine for tennis. And it's really, really important to make sure that you're working on that. So testing. We have to make sure that you test your athletes at least once or twice a year, ideally more than that. Doesn't matter the level. I know that all of you are at the high school level and resources and time are somewhat limited, but we've created a testing protocol that can be implemented really efficiently for large numbers as well. And the good thing is we have dozens of years of data to show where your athletes fit and what they need to get worked on. The reason testing is so important is because you can then get a snapshot of your athlete and then understand what each athlete needs to spend more time in. If you've got a large team, 10, 20, 30, 40 athletes at a time, you can then bucket your athletes into athletes that maybe need more flexibility work, or athletes that need more stability work, or some athletes that may need some more power development. And then you could group your athletes and allow them to work a little bit more on different things. One of the biggest challenges with groups is not everyone gets what they need. So that's why testing becomes so important, because you can then bucket your athletes into, usually I recommend 3 groupings. For anytime you have more than about 10 to 12 athletes, it makes sense to start bucketing into at least 3 groups. Usually it's someone that needs more power or speed, someone that needs more flexibility, and the third would be someone that needs more stability. And although athletes need all of these at all times, certain athletes are just more deficient in certain areas. But without testing, you're not going to know that. So if you're interested, if you go to that link, the Tennis Fitness Combine, we have a ton of great resources there, and it's specifically designed for tennis. It's fitness tests that can be done with pretty much no equipment, and you can get a good snapshot of what your athletes look like. So for example, this is one of the tests, just a simple jump. You don't need any resources to do this. You can just jump and measure the distance, and then we will tell you where do they fall. And this is based on thousands of athletes that we've tested over the last 20 years. And you'll have a normative data profile of your athlete, meaning that the athlete will be able to see, are they in the really excellent category, the good category, or the needs improvement category. So if we have a look here, from that information, then you get a piece of each of those aspects of the athlete. Now we go into the scenario here where we see a daily training structure. So daily training is really, really important, because what this allows for is, how do you put it all together? This information is from the International Tennis Performance Association. You can get a lot more details there, but in general, you do a general warm-up. That's kind of your jogging around the courts. Then you have dynamic flexibility. So you're working on ranges of motion and mobility predominantly for the athlete. Then once the athlete's warm, they've got that first period of the dynamic flexibility done. Then you go into some speed, agility, and power exercises. Depending on your time frame, this may be as short as 3 minutes to as long as 25 minutes, depending on how you structure your day and how much you want to spend on those areas. Then you would go into tennis practice. And then following tennis practice is how you would then put either your tennis-specific strength training or your tennis endurance. Then you go into your cool down, your static flexibility, and any recovery techniques. Again, this is the same basic routine that we do with our pro athletes, but we also recommend doing this at the high school level, at the junior level, because it gets the athletes prepared and it gets them trained just like a pro athlete should, but knowing that you have some restrictions, larger groups, less time, less resources potentially available, and things like that. But the general physiological and concepts and structure should be the same. So as we see here, this is some best practices, and this information's come directly from the ITPA, the Tennis Performance Trainer curriculum. So it goes into great detail about how to apply it practically. So what do you do immediately before practice, before physical training, immediately after practice, immediately after physical training, in the evenings, if you've got athletes that want to be a little bit better and want to do a little bit more, and then what do you do on your rest days and your recovery days? So again, this gives you a framework, not only of the dynamic warm-up period, which we'll get into a little bit more, but also how it fits within the bigger training program for your tennis athlete. Because it's not just about the dynamic warm-up period, it's about overall physical and athletic development of each and every tennis player that you work with. So a question for everyone out there is, what makes you fast? So stride length, stability at the lower body, specifically the ankle, the knee, and the hip. Your stride frequency, how long each step is stride length, and then how many steps you take per unit of time is your stride frequency. To be fast, you want a long stride length and a long stride and a more amount of strides per second or per minute. Flexibility in the range of motion that they need, and then force into the ground. So if you want your athletes to be faster, which I know every person watching, that's an objective of a coach, is to make your athletes faster, they need to get better at all these things. And if you're not training all these things, how do you expect your athlete to get better at it? Just hitting tennis balls will make them better, but it won't make them better necessarily in all these areas as quickly or as efficiently as you can. So keep that in mind, and that's why we use that dynamic warm-up period, is to work specifically on these things. So again, we know that tennis is a sport requiring repeated, moderate and high intensity movements, which involves high forces and torques. So for that to happen, you can increase your risk of injury if you're not doing the right things. And we want to work on improving performance. And again, remember, that's the whole purpose of the dynamic warm-up period. So here is a situation, and again, I've got a few slides up here showing similar things in a slightly different way, so that you've got some good resources that you can leave with, that you can then look back on and utilize these as you're setting up your dynamic warm-up routines, because they can be different as long as they follow these specific areas. And that's a really important component, is you don't want to just use a standardized protocol. You want to test your athletes first to figure out what they need, and then you want to put them into groups that will train exactly what they need, and then you want to have some variety in there as well, so that they enjoy it and they go through the various movements. So if you're looking for resources, this dynamic stretching book had dozens of plans in there. It's one of the first books I did, and it really was a need that coaches had about, I want sample plans. If you want sample plans, this book, it's available on Amazon, on our websites, but it's called Dynamic Stretching, and it goes through a lot of different plans on how to put it together with examples of all the different exercises. There's hundreds of exercises in there. So again, for the folks that are really interested in exercises, that would be a good resource. So if you ever look here, what we're looking at from this perspective is some of the things that we have to know the difference between dynamic warm-ups and dynamic stretches. And it's important. You can see here a whole list of different exercises that we utilize. You know, ankle series, heel walks, toe walks, side ankle walks, knee hugs, linear lunge variations with rotation, aeroplane walks, straight leg marches, things like that. So if you have a look here, we'll just go through a few of them so you get a sense of what we're talking about. So this is just an ankle mobility exercise. And a lot of high school athletes have rolled their ankle a few times already in their junior career. So they have some stiffness issues. They sometimes have some mobility limitations. So doing this on a regular basis looks pretty simple, but it provides great value because it allows the athlete to get a little bit more range on a daily basis. So that would be some of the ankle related work. Now we get into the ankle series. So this is a heel walk. This is one of the more common movements, and especially for high school athletes, male and female, this becomes really important because what we're doing here is we're walking on our heels. And the reason this is important, one is it works on ankle stability, but number two is it strengthens a muscle in the front of the shin called the anterior tibialis. And that is a area of the body that many high school athletes get pain. We've all heard of shin splints. High school athletes are the #1 age group to experience shin splints. So this is one of those exercises that will strengthen that muscle group that helps prevent shin splints. And that's why adding the heel walk on a daily basis is really, really important. So when we go to a toe walk now, this is working on the opposite movement. This is working on our calves, and it's working on being able to stabilize through the ankle. Again, we're spending a lot of time at the ankle because this is what the last major joint that the body puts in contact with the ground. And for you to develop force and your athletes to run and move quickly and then decelerate quickly, which is also important, you need to have good stability through the ankle joint. So these exercises are something that should be incorporated on a daily basis in your routine. Side ankle walks, #1 area of injury in high school tennis players is ankle sprains. So we know that. This is why we do this exercise, and I'll show you that again just so you get to see it a little bit. You're walking slightly on the side of your ankles there, and the goal is to get them strong and stable just at the point before they're about to roll their ankle. And again, you got to be careful with doing this. You don't want to do this movement. You just want to do it enough that the athlete gets a little bit stronger in that position just before they're about to roll it. And that's something that you want to make sure you do, because we've all been there. We've seen an athlete playing well in a match and then rolls their ankle and either has to default or they lose a bit of spring in their step and they're not as fast, and that becomes a problem. These are knee to chest hugs, very common movement. There's a lot of ways to do this movement, but notice how the knees are coming up, the toes are pointing to the sky. They're working on balance. They're working on single leg stability. All these little things that go into one movement if they're coached right. So make sure that when you do these, you coach the athlete correctly. Make sure that they're doing it with great technique, great form, and it provides great value. So lunge variations, we have about 20 different lunges that we utilize with our athletes. Linear lunges, lateral lunges, rotational lunges, 3-way, 4-way, 5-way lunges. This is a standard linear lunge with the arms crossed in front. The reason the arms are crossed is to try to improve posture. And it also then allows you to do variations from here. You can rotate. You can move the body left or right. You can do lateral flexion. Putting the arms above the head changes your center of mass, makes it a little bit harder. So again, there's a lot of ways to make these movements more challenging, more complicated, more complex, depending on who your athletes are. And again, the goal here is to work on different areas that we need for the tennis athlete to be better. Here's a linear lunge with rotation. We know how important rotation is for ground strokes. This is one way to get a little bit more range through the thorax, through the trunk region and core, and trying to get those athletes to be able to open up a little bit more. So here's a lateral lunge variations. Many of your high school athletes struggle with depth in this position, getting into that outside hip or that lateral hip there. And it's one of the goals here of these movements is to be able to get your athletes deep into that hip as low as they can, knowing that they're going to have some restrictions. They're going to have some hip tightness. All tennis players usually don't have super mobile hips, partly due to hours, thousands of hours of training per year, where they actually have to load the hip, decelerate, stabilize, and then reaccelerate. So spending time on this on a daily basis is only going to help get more range. This is a tough exercise. The moment you put your arms above your head, it becomes a little bit more challenging. And notice how both athletes here that are good athletes are still struggling to maintain posture once the arms go above the head. So here's another lunge variation. Here's a straight leg lunge, meaning the back leg is as straight as possible. This gets the hip flexor a lot more. This gets the athlete working through the hip flexor a lot more. And it's one of the tougher movements to do correctly. So again, there's a lot of variations in our lunge series that we do. All of these have a specific focus that help the tennis athlete because they're designed. Lunges aren't tennis specific by themselves, but when you add all these variations, they make it highly specific. It makes it, on areas we know tennis players are tighter than they should be. Here we're going into the aeroplane movement, really, really tough movement for many athletes. Specifically here, what we're looking at is the ability to stabilize on a single leg. And this is much more of a strength and stability and balance exercise than a flexibility exercise. The goal here is to stabilize through the single leg that's on the ground, trying to maintain hip position, trying to maintain eye gaze, spine should be level. And again, these athletes are doing it really well. It's a very challenging exercise. You have to coach this one. You have to make sure your athletes are paying attention and are focused because it's really important to make sure that they do it with good technique. So here you go, straight leg march. It's a tough exercise, more of a hamstring, dynamic hamstring exercise here to work on these positions to try to make sure the athlete can keep the legs straight as much as possible. And again, the athletes go through these movements, walking straight leg march, and making sure that they try not to bend the knee. Okay, here is a really tough exercise. This is the Spider-Man crawl. So as you can see here, you're trying to keep your butt down as low as possible. You're trying to push your foot on outside of your hands, and then you're trying to bring the legs across. And the athletes are doing a good job here. You can see both of them have some tightness. The male athlete here is a little tighter than the female athlete, and that's pretty common. You're going to see that more often than not. And the goal is each time to just increase the range of motion through the hips. This is a really important hip opening exercise. So anyone with tight hips, they're going to have a challenge taking big steps here, which is fine. Take smaller steps, but just keep working on increasing the hip positioning. This is a coordination exercise. Thumb back, thumb down is what we call this one. And it's really about keeping your arms straight, keeping your posture tall, and working on shoulder range of motion, making sure the athletes can get their shoulders in the right positions here. So now we take it into more explosive type movements. Once the athletes goes through that series of mobility, stability exercises, we take them into speed, agility, and power. Quick feet drills, and there's a lot of varieties that you all probably know go at this point. And the goal here is to see how many ground contacts you can do in the shortest amount of time possible. And for example, here, you'll see this, the goal here is to go as fast as we can in a shortest amount of time as you can. And you can change up the variations here. So from this standpoint here, you can kind of see where the athletes will work through it here. And the goal is really to make sure that they're working on ground contacts, they're working on explosiveness, and they're trying to go as fast as possible without losing balance. So as you can see, these athletes are both pretty good athletes. Notice how the one in the front has a little bit more explosiveness than the one with the white shoes. And that's you're going to see across your teams. You're going to see the ones that do that one really well and the ones that need a little bit more time and effort on it. So as you can see here, the athletes are planning on doing a change of direction drill. So all they're doing is sprinting, changing direction, working on the recovery step a little bit, but the goal here is really just to get blood flow going, get them to change direction effectively, decelerate into the corner, come out of the corner effectively, and work on making sure the mechanics were good as well. So hopefully that gave you a sense of some good exercises that you can implement. As I mentioned, there's a ton of exercises that are available. It's not so much which exercises, but it's how do you apply it. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what does the research tell us about static stretching. And for the folks that aren't that familiar, static stretching is a term used to describe when you say, get to an end range of motion and hold it for a certain amount of time. Touching your toes and holding it for 30 seconds would be an example of static stretching. Most of the things we showed on the video previously, actually all the things that we showed on the video previously, was considered dynamic stretching movements. And the big difference is dynamic stretching means there's movement and there's usually force and there's usually some type of activity going on with the stretching or the mobility movement. Static stretching is you find an end range and you hold the end range. They both have value. So static stretching is not a negative. It can be a negative if it's used before tennis practice or matches. So we don't recommend utilizing that type of stretching before you play. We prefer to utilize dynamic stretching. The reason being is there's hundreds of studies that have showed similar outcomes, that if you do static stretching within about 45 minutes to an hour of high velocity, high power, high strength physical training, tennis would be an example, you will see a decrease in performance, which is not what we want. And so it's really important to understand that. So it's understanding when and how to effectively utilize the static stretching routines. So here we have a series of movements that you can kind of walk through, and I'll show you these all together. And so why is all this important? Because dynamic stretching by itself does not make you a tennis player. All these type movements from a physical training perspective makes you a tennis player, meaning that you're in the positions that a tennis athlete needs to be in. You're working on the ranges of motion that you need to be in. You're working on movement patterns, loading parameters, and transfer of power. So these are all ground stroke based drills. All four of them are similar but different, working on improving ground stroke mechanics, movement mechanics, loading mechanics, and transition. So when you're doing a dynamic warm-up, make sure that you keep this in mind, that even though some of those exercises we showed in the dynamic warm-up may not be as specific as these, that doesn't mean there isn't a great purpose, because to do some of these movements, we have to improve ankle range of motion, we have to improve hip stability, we have to improve single leg strength, we have to improve range of motion through the lower body and the trunk. So all those things I just mentioned were drills that we did in the dynamic warm-up that can transfer directly to improve position in these scenarios. So again, you have to understand, and you have to also communicate with your players why some of those dynamic warm-up movements are so important. It's not just a warm-up. It's to try to make them better athletes so they can do these movements and these positions a lot better. So something that's really important to keep in mind is that prehab, rehab, injury prevention, many times they're used interchangeably, should be part of all forms of training. So we have this term in the strength and conditioning world and the physical therapy and athletic training worlds: training is rehab and rehab is training. What does that mean? That pretty much means that every day you train, you are rehabbing to a certain extent, or you're prehabbing. You're trying to reduce inefficiencies, improve stability and strength, get athletes to be better at what they should be able to do from an athletic performance perspective on a daily basis. So don't break it out as this is just injury prevention exercises, or this is just speed and performance training exercises. That's not the best way to structure it. The best way is to integrate all of them together so that athletes are training. And when you're training, you're becoming more resilient. You can handle more load, you can handle more positions, and it prepares you better to be able to play tennis on a regular basis. This is really important the higher up levels that you play, the higher up level that your tennis player is, because their volume is going to be a lot higher. You know, some players you deal with may only play 3 or 4 hours a week. Others may be playing 20 hours a week. It's a big, big difference in who you work with and what they need. So hopefully you can get the better players, the ones that are practicing more, playing more. They need to do more in the sense of their dynamic warm-ups need to be more structured, more intense, more customized to a certain extent to what they need as well. And that goes back to the testing aspect. So now I'm going to go through a couple body parts and highlight some areas that you should be able to evaluate, and then make sure you've got an exercise or two in your program to make sure the athlete can handle it. So if I was to show you this athlete and I was to say, first off, what do you see here? Notice where the right arrow is on the right arm. It's pretty clear here that this athlete is a right-handed tennis player. Why? Because they can't fully straighten that right arm. Notice the right elbow, there's sort of a bend there at the elbow. They can't really fully straighten. Quite common to see. This is not necessarily concerning. This is an adaptation potentially that has happened over many years of high-level training. This is a collegiate athlete, so this athlete has been playing high-level tennis for at least a decade. And this is an adaptation that occurs. And the challenge is you're okay with a few degrees difference between left and right, but you don't want 15 or 20 degrees difference, which is what we see here. This is quite extreme. So you've got to make sure your athletes don't have that inefficiency or that extreme difference. Another way to assess it is have a look here. If you look at the photo on your right, so right in here, this is a very good looking shoulder from a scapular standpoint. This area here is your scapula. You know, you've got your muscles of your upper back, muscles of your lower back, and you see that the scapula is in a normal position at this point, and the musculature is normal. Now, if we see on this side on the left, we see on the right side, the scapula is down, it's pulling, it looks uncomfortable, and we've got a lot different visual. This is the same day, same exercise. The only difference here is the right fist, the right arm is on the left photo, is the bottom, and that's what it's assessing, is right internal range of motion. This is assessing left internal range of motion. It's very obvious here that this athlete has a pretty significant restriction in their internal shoulder rotation tightness. This leads to shoulder impingement potentially, and some other possible inefficiencies in mechanics. So we want to make sure that we do movements to try to help, one, increase range of motion there, but two, also strengthen that right shoulder. So there's a whole series of different exercises that can be done. And it's important to understand that all four of these can be incorporated into a program. So a lot of these exercises are on the Kovacs Academy site. This is our sort of membership site through our institute. We have thousands of hours of content on there. But all these four are shoulder-based exercises. So we've got one with a towel on the right side there, and that's a performance-based exercise, trying to get the athlete to generate more power. So that one correlates with increased serve speed from that perspective. You know, here we've got three other shoulder strengthening exercises here. So again, depending on what the athlete needs, the athlete can work on a series of different movements, from stability and posture, which is the top left, to strength, which is the bottom right, to power, which is the top right here. And then this is a highly specific movement from that perspective. So we've got a whole series of different movements that can be done here. And from that standpoint, it's one of the ones that, you know, athletes can get better at. So here we have hip stability. When we're talking about hip stability, we have to understand mechanics issues. These are both high school tennis players, high-level high school tennis players, but here's a situation where you see poor hip stability. Notice how the back knee is collapsing. We sometimes call that knee valgus. On the player on the right here, we actually see back knee and front knee both collapsing. So that immediately sends a signal that we have some hip stability issues. So from that scenario, what we want to work on is we want to work on some simple exercises. Here is what's called a monster walk, a lateral band walk. Very common movement, but really important for improving hip stability. So from that perspective here, we would do something like that. And then we would also include a hip bridge with hip abduction. So this hip bridge with hip abduction is something that will significantly work on this movement as well. So again, it's one of those scenarios that when you're working with your players, you want to make sure that you understand where their limitations are and then give them a series of movements during that dynamic warm-up period that can work on that. But without testing your athletes, you're not exactly sure what you need to work on. Both of these are great for just about every tennis player, so they can be incorporated daily. But again, once you get to a higher level with players, you want to then be a bit more specific and a bit more customized. How about lower back? Most high school players start to experience some lower back pain if they play sports at a pretty high level and if they play quite a bit of tennis. The biggest challenge in high school tennis athletes is we see a lot of what's called pars fractures or stress reactions in the lower back. And we usually see that at L4, L5, or S1. That's part of the spine area. So there's lower back is kind of all of that encompassed together. And usually that's a result of poor technique and or excessive volume. But a lot of the time it's poor technique, actually. It's athletes that are over-rotating too early, collapsing by their core, and putting their spine in a really challenging position. So this is what we call a concerned area or a red flag area that we want to make sure that we do enough training on. So there's two things that can happen off court that you can spend quite a bit of time working on. One is working on your upper thoracic region. And this is an area of interest for most people, is this upper thoracic or open book movement. And then you want to do some pretty extensive core training. And again, depending on your athlete, your core training is going to come and be done in multiple different ways. So if you see here, this is a more advanced exercise. The athlete's feet aren't being touched on. They're having to stabilize through their core with a med ball. And again, this athlete is well conditioned and well trained. Wouldn't necessarily do this advanced type of training with every athlete. You have to know that they have the stability. You have to know that they have the muscular endurance to handle it. But again, some short 2, 3, 4 minute core routines before practice can, one, activate the core effectively. You don't want to fatigue them out too much before you play, but having a small amount of core activation can be really helpful for the athlete and prepare them really well. So this is common movements with med balls here. Here's a hamstring exercise. This is a power hamstring movement that we're doing here with the medicine ball. Here's the form of a plank, a brace plank with a isolation of the lower abs. The athlete has to then stabilize against some movement. This is quite a challenging exercise. But again, really, really good movement to get the core activated, to get the movement to be what needs to happen. So the athlete has to stabilize. And again, lifting a leg makes it even more challenging. Lifting another leg makes it very challenging. And that's a scenario where the athlete can work on. So if you want to see a series of the warm-ups, I went through them earlier. Here's an example of exercises. And usually you put 10 to 12. I'll get that question a lot. How many exercises should be in a warm-up? With our pros, we may do up to 20. With our high school athletes or junior athletes that may be limited on time, we can usually get a good dynamic warm-up done with about 10 exercises. You can do a really good warm-up in 5 minutes. 15 minutes is ideal. So it just depends a little bit on how much time you may have access to and how you're able to implement it. The longer the better, because you can then work on more things, you can do more reps of it, but at least getting 5 to 10 minutes of a quality dynamic warm-up will be really impactful. So then you've got a series of speed, power, sprint type movements that you can incorporate. And for example, here, this is just one of the many sample programs from the ITPA. This goes through an X drill, a spider drill, a four cone drill, a slalom agility run, a jump sprint, and then up and back movements. You do a series of those very high velocity movements, quick explosive exercises, that an athlete can do with a little bit of rest, and you can implement that to get the athlete ready to go before they play. So again, there's a lot of different ways to do this. You want to also make sure though that you incorporate enough hip stretching, because one of the biggest things that we've seen over 2 decades of doing this is high school athletes, their hips are really tight. Their hips get restricted because of how much tennis they play, how much sitting they do, things like that. So you want them on some form of hip stretching routine. There's a lot of different hip stretches out there. We have a floor-based hip stretching routine. We have a whole bulletproof hip series that we utilize with our athletes that goes through sample programs from a 5-minute routine all the way up to a 30-minute hip routine. So just depending on what you're looking for, you want to make sure, though, that you're giving your athletes the opportunity, not necessarily with you, understanding that team practices take up a lot of your time, but at least you have resources available, or you can direct them to resources that can give them a way to work on their hip range of motion, hip stability as much as possible. One of the things that what we try to make sure we incorporate with every warm-up is some type of tennis-specific movement and footwork. And this is a free resource through the ITPA that goes through over 30 of the most important tennis movements. And the good and bad part about tennis is it has very specific and very unique footwork patterns, which makes it challenging sometimes, because you need to know what an open stance forehand looks and feels like. You need to know what a recovery step out of the corner looks like, a V drill movement, a serve and volley footwork pattern, a overhead footwork pattern. They're all different, and not many sports actually have similar footwork patterns to tennis. So this goes through each movement that we see on the tennis court. It's a free download, so just go to itpa-tennis.org and there'll be a pop-up there, and you'll just put your email in and you'll get the free download, and that'll allow you to see all those movements. It's a really nice workbook that goes through each movement, shows the photos, shows what to look for, and then you can get a little bit better with training those movements towards the end of your dynamic warm-up, just before you start your tennis practice. Because without training tennis-specific movements, our warm-up is not specific enough for the sport, and we've got to make sure it transfers really well. So again, we do a lot of work on the movement side, analyzing movements, where in the court, how many movements, how many accelerations per set an athlete may have. Here's an example of what you would get in that workbook. As you can see here, some of these names you may be familiar. I think most of you are familiar with a front crossover step, but are you familiar with what a runaround shuffle attack looks like, or an open stance drop down, or a forward hit and hop, runaround shuffle, drop step, runaround forehand, two-step shuffle? So this is allowing us all to use the same language, and we have thousands of coaches around the world that use this language. It's sort of a standardized language that allows you to communicate with your players on a consistent basis, show them the movement, use the right terminology, and then if you do have work with a strength and conditioning coach or a movement coach or someone outside of you, you can then at least show them this and say, this is the movements that I want you to work on off court with the players. And it's really, really valuable, and it's made a huge difference in our worlds, working with coaches, trainers, therapists, strength coaches, movement specialists, to say, this is the movement specifically that I need you to make my athletes better in. And it really allows everyone to be on the same page and allows to talk from the same playbook. Again, return to serve movements, overhead movements, volley movements, etc. So, this is a great resource, and it's free. So just go to itpa-tennis.org and you'll be able to get that with visuals and things like that. Here are a few more resources. This is in the PDF that you'll be getting along with this presentation. And I'd just like to thank everyone for the opportunity to be here. I know, I work with coaches year round, and we're actually running a special at the Institute on all our courses for the first 100 coaches that use the code TTCA. And this will allow you to get 15% of any of our courses at the Kovacs Institute. So just go to that link, and the first 100 coaches will get that discount. So again, I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity to be here, sharing some education, and look forward to the rest of the conference.
Mark, thank you so much. That was really good. I know our coaches are going to get a lot out of that. So I appreciate your time with us.
Yeah, no problem at all. And keep up the good work developing your players.